Welcome to Job Talks Access. Today I'm with John Pico, the chair of the Department of Marketing at George Brown College. How are you doing, John?
I'm great, Paul. How are you?
I'm fantastic. Thanks for joining us. I'm wondering if you could just start off with talking a little bit about your role at George Brown and how you feel like accessibility plays a factor.
Sure. So I joined the college as chair of the School of Marketing back in August of last year. So I'm relatively new to the role, but that follows many years in business, in management, and in marketing specifically at major events. And I worked with the Canadian National Exhibition and other major events across the country. And I've also been a part-time faculty member at both a college and university in Toronto. So I bring both of those pieces to the table when I think about my role here at the college. And in this role, I'm really interested in having an environment that is open and inclusive, not only across race and gender and all perspectives that define who people are, but also with respect to their abilities and ensuring that we have open access to everyone.
Yes, absolutely. That's great. And shifting a little bit into our actual Job Talks Access project, we've done a national survey and found that workers with disabilities really want to be relied upon. They want to take on responsibility and progress in their careers, but often they just find themselves underutilized. In your experience, do you think you've seen this kind of situation? And what do you think Canadian businesses could do to become more inclusive?
Sure, I think that's a really great question. And it's something that I've witnessed firsthand in some of my previous work. There was a time when I was at the Canadian National Exhibition where we would hire people and perhaps had, I would say, a passive approach to hiring people with various abilities. And I don't know that we fully understood or appreciated what it was that we were really trying to do, other than we had a loose objective about hiring people that met a bit of a quota.
Mhm.
Anyway, this is a very long story, and we can get into it a little bit later, perhaps, but we went through an awakening at that organization, and we worked with an external consultant to help us define a really open and inclusive policy of hiring people across the spectrum of abilities. First of all, we recognized in a tight labor market that access to greater pools of labor was an important resource for us to tap into. And secondly, we recognized that up to that point in time, we would make all sorts of silly accommodations for people with different abilities that weren't necessary nor were they appreciated. And it wasn't until we recognized that we could hold people to account for the job and the requirements of the job that we actually had much better engagement and higher degrees of performance overall. So I fully understand the nature of the question about let's not hire people because we have a quota to say we need people in wheelchairs to make us look good, but instead address our business challenges and hire people with abilities that can help us pursue those challenges.
Absolutely. Yeah, I love that. Taking a more proactive, uh, I guess, approach to finding people as opposed to, just as you say, filling a quota.
Right.
And another thing we found actually is that in general, workers with disabilities found that their peers and their coworkers are much more helpful and supportive in the workplace as opposed to the actual organization itself. So I'm wondering, would you say that you have any thoughts on why that might be or what could be done to break that kind of pattern?
Well, I guess it's really a starting point is recognizing that on a human to human level, where people define relationships, we need to allow those relationships to flourish rather than having the role that we fulfill define our relationships. In other words, as a manager, therefore, I must interact with an individual a certain way. Instead, let's turn that around and recognize that let's have the relationships define the roles. So in other words, on a one-to-one or a one-to-many sort of interaction or relationship model, I think it's about good people doing good work together and supporting an environment to allow that to happen and to flourish, rather than to say the organization again has a directive or a quota to do something. Allow it to flourish at a grassroots level.
Mhm. Absolutely, just being more collaborative as a group.
Exactly. When it comes down to it, work has to get done and objectives have to get met. Let good people, regardless of their specific circumstances, but let good people approach those and they'll rise to the challenge.
And this may not surprise you, but another thing we found is that based on our survey results, that businesses or organizations that are more inclusive and supportive will lead to overall better outcomes for workers with disabilities when it comes to things like their wages, higher wages, their job satisfaction, and just positive feelings overall. So I'm wondering, would you say you've seen that reflected in your organization or previous organizations in your career?
Yeah, one of the biggest aha moments I had, again, back at the Canadian National Exhibition, was recognizing that when we build platforms for access, maybe because of the needs of a particular group require it, in fact, everybody benefits.
Mhm.
And the simple illustration of that is when we build a ramp to go up an elevation, sure, it's built for someone that has a device that requires it. But look at pedestrian movement in a place like the CNE. 99% of people are using the ramp, not the stairs. In other words, that infrastructure benefits a larger population of people than just those that it was designed for. And
Mhm.
I think that that's true across the board, that when you think about uh, compensation and incentive strategy, or you think about overall business strategy, when you open yourself up, I think that you can achieve greater outcomes because there's more pathways to lead you to that success.
Exactly. Yes, I love that. Um, so this maybe is going back to something you alluded to earlier, but a lot of businesses we see implementing equity, diversity, inclusion policies, which is fantastic. But I'm wondering, do you feel like accessibility is being adequately addressed in these organizations?
Hmm. Well, so currently at George Brown College, we have a major initiative away on a number of fronts. They're separate, but they're related. One is around EDI. The other is around truth and reconciliation and issues related to Indigenous affairs, if that's a term. But recognizing that we have a long way to go as a society, but certainly as a college, to be more open and more inclusive of all people. And we've got work to do. And I think that perhaps in the past we were more limited in focusing in on physical abilities, and maybe that was a category in and of itself. But but truthfully, I think that that does us a disservice to only focus on people with impairments or whatever they might be, or exceptionalities, whatever they might be. If we're just thinking about it in that context, we're not again opening ourselves up to the possibilities that we can address by thinking about accessibility across the board, whether it be race, culture, religion, sexual orientation, or ability. I think it's a more we'll get farther, quicker by being more open and more inclusive.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And would you say there's anything in particular that you find frustrating when you think about the path to success for workers with disabilities?
Yeah, I would say that one of the biggest limiting factors is that we treat those with different abilities with kit gloves. Maybe it's because as individuals, we haven't had exposure. We somehow feel empathy or feel sorry for someone. And that limits, I guess, the opportunity to move forward in, where you have equal partners addressing a situation. And I think that um, I hearken back to elementary schools and when a time when my children were in school. Some of the greatest learning that they had was being exposed to children with autism that were placed in their classroom, and recognizing that some of their frustrations or their complaints were quite minuscule in comparison to the challenges faced by others. And I think that until you though realize that we're all on this planet together and we all have a way that we can contribute, and that by finding a path for contribution, until we can do that together, I think we're holding everyone back. So that I would say is the biggest frustration. It's around, seeing too many people not approaching those with disabilities as being equals, but they're somehow less because they're confined in some way. We need to get past all of that and treat everyone as comrades and focus on the objectives.
Absolutely. I think that relates perfectly to what we were saying earlier in our survey results about people wanting to be relied upon and take on responsibility, but they just can't they can find a situation where people have trust in them. And I think what you said is absolutely correct. We need to just be open to different abilities and different ways of doing things so that everyone has the same opportunities.
Right, absolutely. Again, I'll draw or share a personal story with you that my son was adopted as an infant from a foreign orphanage. And he had some language delays. He was converted from his mother tongue to English. Obviously, in our home, we only speak English. And that manifested itself in a number of other challenges, especially as he was approaching school age. So we were working at the time with a speech and language pathologist who took it upon herself to tell us that she felt he had serious learning disabilities. She was neither qualified nor experienced to provide that judgment, but nevertheless she did. And that was the first time that we realized that there would be people shutting the door to our son, rather than opening the door to say, here's the direction we can take together. It was, teacher after teacher telling us that he needed an IEP plan that was going to reduce expectations. He needed to be in a 2-year vocational stream, moving into high school, not in an academic stream, and on it goes. Well, so now we are all these years later. My son is 27 and he's a university graduate. He has just finishing off a post grad diploma at a college. He's, by every measure, he's finding his way and his success. And I can't help but think how many people would have stood in his way. And had we not been there to advocate for him, he would have been shut down. And perhaps that's the message maybe that we all as employers need to get our head around is let's stop closing doors for people and instead open the doors wherever we can.
Absolutely. And on that note, I wanted to ask, is there, looking forward, do you feel like there's things that give you optimism that workers with disabilities will have more opportunities in the future?
I think another statistic that I was really startled by back in my journey at the CNE on this topic, and that is that 16% of the Canadian population has a disability of some sort, either visible or invisible. And in a tight labor market like the one we're facing today, employers need to recognize that that's a pool of capable, ready, talented resources that will help them and help their businesses grow and thrive. So I think statistically alone that there's going to be growth and room for optimism. And as we continue as a society to deal with truth and reconciliation and with EDI, and recognizing that the world is better when we're open, not closed, I do think it will spell more success for people with all abilities.
It's great. Yeah, exactly. So finally, John, I just wanted to ask if you would think of one thing in particular that you believe would be your greatest positive change as far as a step forward for accessibility in the workplace, what do you think that would be?
I would say it's got to be around attitude adjustment. And I think attitudes will change. Often, what's that old phrase about necessity is the mother of all invention? Especially in a tight labor market, I think that will force employers to take a harder look at the choices that are available to them. And that will lead to change in attitudes, especially as we can see how it will contribute directly to the bottom line. But I'm optimistic that as a society, we continue to, as I've said, a couple of times, as we continue to try to be more open and more honest with ourselves, recognizing it's not, we're not trying to be patronizing to any one individual or any group of people, but rather that together we'll achieve more. I think that attitude needs to be embraced and be more pervasive. And that would be my hope.
Absolutely. Yeah, I totally agree. So John, thanks for joining us, taking the time to share your insight and experience and helping us make a difference with the Job Talks Access Project.
Excellent, Paul. It's been my pleasure today, and I think you're doing great work, and I commend you for the work that's underway, and I wish you nothing but success.
Thank you. Appreciate that. That was John Pico, and I'm Paul Vandergrift. This has been another Job Talks Access.